learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all of our 7th graders out there, though anyone is welcome to tune in. This is the 5th lesson in this week's series of lessons. My name is Mrs. Alley, and I'm a 7th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I'm so excited to be your teacher for today's lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. If you didn't see our previous lessons, you can find them at www.tn.gov/education. You can still tune in to today's lesson if you haven't seen any of our others. But it might be more fun if you first go back and watch our previous lessons, as we will be referring to what we've learned in previous lessons today. Today we will be learning about Lucretia Mott's speech entitled Discourse on Women. Before we get started, to participate fully in our lesson today, you're going to need a few things. Some paper, a pencil, and a hard surface to write on. Let's begin. Today, we will be comparing a speech written by Lucretia Mott to Abigail Adams's letter to see if women's rights have improved. So, in the previous 2 lessons, we have been discussing Abigail Adams's letter to her husband, John Adams, and then John's letter back to his wife, Abigail. We noted that Abigail was really beginning to speak up for women's rights in her letter to John by asking him to keep in mind that women should be remembered when drafting the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to write a quick list of what Abigail was asking her husband to do as one of the founding fathers. Be sure to copy this list onto your own piece of paper. We'll be referring to it throughout today's lesson. First, let's reflect. Abigail asks that the writers remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. She also asks that husbands give up the title of master and then think of themselves more as a friend to women. The next thing she asks is, don't think of women as just empty jars that can't think for themselves. She finally asks that men be protective of women, but not the bosses of women. This was all written in 1776. I think that she was ahead of her time, don't you? Okay, here's where we're going to write our list. Make sure that you copy everything that I have written. First, let's write down as number 1 on our list, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. That's number 1. Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Number 2. She also asks that husbands give up the title of master and then think of themselves more as friend to women. Let's make sure to add that to our list. She also asks that husbands give up the title of master and then think of themselves more as a friend to women. Awesome. Let's continue. Number 3. Don't think of women as just empty jars that can't think for themselves. Let's add that. Don't think of women as just empty jars that can't think for themselves. And finally, number 4. Be protective of women, but not the bosses of women. Be protective of women, but not the bosses of women. Excellent. Please make sure that you have all 4 items on your list, as we are going to refer to these throughout the lesson. Today, our goal is to read an excerpt from a speech given by Lucretia Mott in 1849. She was considered one of the leading people pushing for more rights for women. After we read and comprehend her speech, we'll decide if much had changed for women over the 75 years between Abigail Adams's letter to Lucretia Mott's speech. We will begin with me showing you what that looks like. And then there will be time for you to practice on your own with my support. Finally, I will assign you independent work that you can complete after the video ends. Ready? Let's get started. Okay, let's read. This is a difficult text, so our goal on the first read is just to get the gist and focus on a couple of powerful vocabulary words. The question is often asked, what does woman want more than she enjoys? What is she seeking to obtain? Of what rights is she deprived? What privileges are withheld from her? I answer, she asks nothing as favor, but as right. She wants to be acknowledged a moral, responsible being. So she's starting out by saying, people often ask what woman wants. And her answer to that question is that last bit I read. She wants to be acknowledged a moral, responsible being. But what does that mean? Let's read on to find out. She continues. In marriage, there is assumed superiority on the part of the husband. and admitted inferiority with a promise of obedience on the part of the wife. This subject calls loudly for examination in order that the wrong may be readdressed. Redressed basically means corrected, but in a moral sense. It's used when we're talking about righting a wrong, bringing something to justice. So Ma is saying that there is an injustice here that needs to be fixed. She goes on. Walker of Cincinnati, in his Introduction to American Law, says, "The law of husband and wife, as you gather it from the books, is a disgrace to any civilized nation. The theory of the law degrades the wife almost to the level of slaves." There are many instances now in our city where the wife suffers much from the power of the husband to claim all she can earn with her own hands. In my intercourse with the poorer class of people, I have known extreme cruelty from the hard earnings of the wife being thus robbed by the husband, and no redress at law. There's that word, redress, again. Do you remember what it meant? That's right, righting a wrong or fighting injustice. In other words, finding justice. So where there is no redress, there's no way to right a wrong. Mott wraps up by saying, "Let woman then go on not asking as favor, but claiming as right the removal of all the hindrances to her elevation in the scale of being. Let her receive encouragement for the proper cultivation of all her powers, so that she may enter profitably into the active business of life." Wow, she's quoting someone who says that back then, at least, being a wife was almost as bad as being a slave. Let's read on to see how she supports that claim. She says, "The merging of her name in that of her husband is emblematic of the fate of all her legal rights. The legal theory is that marriage makes the husband and wife one person, and that person is the husband. On this subject, reform is loudly called for. There is no foundation in reason or expediency for the absolute and slavish subjection of the wife to the husband, which forms the foundation of the present legal relations." Do you know what emblematic means? That's right. An emblem is like a symbol. So emblematic means symbolic. If the way a woman loses her family name when she gets married is symbolic of the fate of all her legal rights, then maybe Ma is saying that women lose their legal rights when they get married, just like they lose their names. Let's read on. All right, let's add these two terms to our notes. So we've been through the text once, Remember those two important words we discussed? First was emblematic, meaning symbolic. Let's write that down. Mott says that women losing their names when they get married is emblematic of how they lose other things, like legal rights. Then there was redress, a way to right a wrong. Let's add that to our notes. Mott says that women in her time have no redress for the wrongs being done to them. Okay, now that we've gotten the gist and a couple of key vocabulary words, are you ready for a second read? I'll read some parts this time that I didn't read the first time because I think you're ready for more detail. This time, let's try to start answering that question Mott starts with. What do women want? As I read, every time we find something that Mott mentioned she wants for women, we will write it down. Then we're going to see if anything has changed between what women wanted in 1776 and 1849. The question is often asked, what does woman want more than she enjoys? What is she seeking to obtain? Of what rights is she deprived? What privileges are withheld from her? I answer, she asks nothing as favor, but as right. She wants to be acknowledged a moral, responsible being. So first Mott starts off with a bunch of questions that are rhetorical. I know that rhetorical questions are questions that aren't necessarily meant to be answered right away. So I'm going to skip the first statement. She says that everything that she is asking for shouldn't be considered as men just doing a favor by granting their wishes. Instead, it should be granted as a right because women are moral, responsible beings. So let's write this in our notes. Women should be granted rights because they are responsible beings just like men. Wow, sounds like one of the things Abigail Adams was thinking. Interesting. If Mott is still asking for it, I don't think things have changed much since her time. Let's read some more. In marriage, there is assumed superiority on the part of the husband and admitted inferiority with a promise of obedience on the part of the wife. This subject calls loudly for examination in order that the wrong may be redressed. What is her next subject that she thinks should be examined when thinking about equal rights? Good, marriage. What does she say needs to be re-examined in marriage? Yep, she feels that men assume that they are superior and that women accept their roles as being inferior. What does she want to be done with this? She thinks the structure needs to be looked at again. Good. Let's add all this to our notes. Good. And remember what the word redress means? She's saying that re-examining that structure of marriage is the first step toward redressing the wrong being done to women in her society. All right, let's skip down to line 22 and begin reading from there. Walker of Cincinnati, in his introduction to American law, says, "The law of husband and wife, as you gather it from the books, is a disgrace to any civilized nation. The theory of the law degrades the wife almost to the level of slaves." She cites a person by the last name of Walker, saying that any civilized nation should be ashamed of the way this country thinks of marriage. In fact, what does she say the law surrounding marriage practically makes a wife? Yes, a slave. Then she goes on. Listen. The merging of her name and that of her husband is emblematic of the fate of all her legal rights. Do you remember what we said that meant? Correct. By taking the last name of the man is a perfect symbol for giving up all her legal rights. Let's pause for just a minute and look back over our notes about Abigail James that we discussed earlier. Do you see similarities between what rights the two are asking for? What about differences? You don't have to write anything down yet. I just want to give you a couple of minutes to think. All right, let's move on. Let's skip down to the last paragraph. Let woman then go on, not asking a favor, but claiming as right the removal of all the hindrances to her elevation in the scale of being. Let her receive encouragement for the proper cultivation of all her powers, so that she may enter profitably into the active business of life. What is meant by let woman then go on not asking as favor, but claiming as right the removal of all the hindrances to her elevation in the scale of being? Great. Mott doesn't make it a secret that she would like to stop asking for rights, but to demand them so that they can be considered equals. So, what does she mean by let her receive encouragement for the proper cultivation of all her powers, so that she may enter profitably into the active business of life? Yes, indeed. A woman should be encouraged to become all that she can become so that she can live a full life. Great job dealing with another rigorous passage. I'm really proud of you. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this series of lessons, haven't we? We started with a love poem by a man that we wouldn't really consider a poet that writes about love. Then we read letters from a couple that were truly in love. So much so that Abigail Adams felt comfortable enough to speak out for what she truly believes in, women's rights. This was in a time period that speaking out in a marriage was frowned upon. Finally, we jumped ahead 75 years to see if at least one woman, Lucretia Mott, thought that anything had changed since Abigail spoke out. So that is going to be the focus of your independent work. I'd like for you to look over the notes that we've taken and think back upon the things that we've talked about. Then I would like you to write a paragraph about your thoughts on if anything had changed in women having equal rights between 1776, when Abigail spoke about it to her husband, and 1849, when Lucretia Mott spoke about it to a crowd of listeners. Remember to support your thoughts with the information that you wrote down in your notes. If you want to check back and look again at Abigail Adams' letter and Lucretia Mott's speech, you may do so. Remember, you have access to all of our lessons on the website www.tn.gov/education. I enjoyed working on these passages about women's rights movement with you today. Thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you for our next lesson in Tennessee's At Home Learning series. Bye.